even though it's been many, many years, I felt that squeezing on my heart. Like when I was in it, I, as I've talked about, loved her and hated her so much and felt so dependent. Like, how will I ever survive without her? And yet, as I've shared in so many videos, being in situations in my mid to late 40s, crying my eyes out after she name called me, gone after my kids, really done and said very harmful things. But it was all I ever knew was this swinging, toxic back and forth. And it was a very toxic relationship. But that doesn't mean that there were times when we didn't have a good time and have a similar sense of humor or laugh together. There's nothing quite like the feeling of being eaten alive, consumed by your own parent. Of feeling like you are part of their breath and that they need you to survive, not just in childhood, but often long into your adult life. This is really the case when we talk about engulfment, which can be very common with parents who struggle with some form of narcissism, immaturity, and borderline personality disorder. Of course, all of these things can come from generational trauma, but what we're talking about today is that feeling of being trapped in a relationship with your own parent. I was watching a big story coverage a little bit in the last few weeks about a case I'm not going to go into now, where the outcome was quite extreme, but the situation for the person, the daughter in the situation, was so difficult to escape that they really were trapped mentally, physically, and emotionally by this parent. And so they made a decision and they were recently released. And so please don't post about that case here. But what it triggered in me, obviously on a much lower scale, was a story in which this individual was talking about how they felt like there was no way out. And this isn't about defending their choices, like I'm saying, but it's like it tapped into that feeling that I had. And it reminded me about this dynamic of engulfment that is extremely common with many parents who struggle with some form of emotional insensitivity, immaturity, definitely for parents who have narcissism or borderline traits or the diagnoses potentially. And yes, all of those things can be trauma related, but at the heart, there's a behavior and a dynamic that feels like they're going to absolutely consume you. Alongside that is often a baked-in sense of guilt and responsibility and a feeling that you're not allowed to not be consumed or engulfed, that in fact, if you do anything like set boundaries or change the contact dynamics in some way, you are betraying them. It is your job to be a victim of their engulfment, because these patterns have been long ingrained in us in childhood. So I wanted to share what it can feel like if you are in an engulfing relationship, really with anyone, and oftentimes you can find yourself repeating these patterns with other partners in your adult life, but especially as it relates to engulfing parents. Quick reminder that parents who do these things, I've talked a lot about narcissistic parents, parents who have eggshell qualities, which, like I'm saying, can be traits around borderline immaturity. Of course, always, like we're talking about, trauma-related, potentially, genetics, temperament, things like that, is this belief system from their perspective that, for example, for a narcissistic parent who is engulfing, maybe they were raised by an ignoring parent who paid no attention to them. So they go above and beyond. This often can be, let's say, like a helicopter parent on steroids, right? It is all about, I'm going to control and manage and over-involve myself in your life so much because maybe I'm trying to heal something, maybe I want control, maybe in a more eggshell dynamic, I'm afraid of abandonment. And it may also be a parent who isn't really over-involved in your life, but the underlying message is, I need you. I need you at all times. I need you mentally, physically, emotionally, or all of the above. And you feel that. That's like that, don't leave me, don't abandon me. Or they create situations in life where these kind of parents will need rescuing. So you feel trapped. Or, as I've talked about, the dynamic is so deeply ingrained in you that you feel this love-hate, this push-pull, this thing like, oh my gosh, I'll never survive without them, but also I want to be as far away from them as possible, that intermittent reinforcement of good love and bad love, so that you pull them in to engulfing roles. I've talked about my mom, her living with us like 5 different times when I was married with my kids, thinking that she was helping. But when we looked back on it and realized that there was so much chaos, it was always, there was always going to be some kind of emotional blow and walkout and abandonment and anger when she didn't feel valued, that also there really wasn't that much childcare. It was always when I felt like I had no other choice. But on the outside, it looked like, oh, she's there with you. Why can't you just use her help? And it's not to say she never helped, because she did at times, but the help came with such a price. The point is, I initiated all of that because I felt responsible for her and felt like there'd be some mutual benefit. I would help her, she would help me. But it didn't actually play out that way. But I didn't know that, right? So my point is, we can set up the engulfment as well. This is also really the case when they're helping you with your kids, finances, where you live. I will post about this and people will say, I'm living with this parent, especially because of the economy and things like that. It can be difficult to actively separate for many reasons. And so obviously the more tied and to them you are, mentally, physically, or emotionally, the less you have any awareness and power to understand how engulfing the situation can be. So what does it feel like on the inside to feel trapped? Number one, you're often in a constant state of anxiety and hypervigilance. So you are constantly monitoring for their mood and their responsiveness to you, to your kids, to your spouse. It feels like at any moment, things could go badly. And so you need to stay. It's like oftentimes our nervous systems live in hypervigilance as a result anyway. So this applies whether they're around you or not. But obviously, you could live, thousands of miles away, but feel hypervigilance to make sure you call them every day to check on them, to make sure they're okay. Even though you don't want to, you feel guilty if you don't, and as if it's your responsibility. Or like I'm saying, they live down the street or in your home, things like that. But you're just always on guard for their needs. And that plays out in a chronic anxiety. Number two, you often have a fear of losing their support, their money, whatever it is. Maybe they're a really good person to talk to when you're in a negative headspace. Like that's very common with parents who struggle. And so your glue and bonding can be like bitching about things together. And so in that sense, you feel heard, you join. The problem is that can be your glue and your only glue, and it's very negative. And so maybe you're mad at your spouse, so you call this parent, and it feels good for a minute to offload, but you do it all of the time. It reinforces a negativeness, a bond against your partner, and nothing these parents actually like more unconsciously at a minimum, and consciously if they're aware of it, is to split you off from other partners who feel like a threat to them. Right? So parents who have a difficult time with a strong sense of self they don't have will love it when you're mad at your spouse because you join with them. And that includes any of the kind of parents I talk about on this channel. Number three, fear. Just fear all the way around. Fear of their mood, fear of their mind, fear of their intentions, fear of upsetting them. It really is deeply grounded in a fear and a worry that you often feel. Number four, you often, when you're in this trap dynamic with them, you mask to them. You don't really show them your true self. You have often learned to rotate around them. So you give them a version of you that you know that will make them happy. And oftentimes you don't even know you're doing it. So there's a lot of masking. The next thing is when you're in these engulfed, trapped relationships, it's never really about you. In fact, it wouldn't really be emotionally safe to be about you. So you've learned to really rotate and make the stories you tell, the things you share, the information you withhold or don't withhold is all about providing a version of yourself that unfortunately, since childhood, you felt like was the greatest way to get love from them or your needs met or any kind of real attachment needs. The next one is that it often feels suffocating, like when you really, especially when they're over there, when they are unhappy with you, or you're worried they're unhappy with you, or you feel obligated and guilty, but you also have this sort of learned helplessness where you know that, being needy or asking for your needs to get met or self-advocating, there's like a depressed part of you that can't really activate with them. So you're kind of stuck in that suffocation. And the last couple of things are there's often a lot of jealousy with these kind of engulfing parents. There's this element that other people are a threat, your partner's a threat, your success is a threat, your separating behaviors, we're going to come back to. So you feel this sort of like jealousness around anything to do with them. And the last thing is that a couple things are, it can be really hard to explain even to yourself or to an outsider, especially if on the outside, this parent is like, the best babysitter you think. Actually, what happens when you're not around with your kids isn't great, or how they talk to your kids, or how they defy your rules. Whatever it is, on the outside, especially if they're the over-involved kind that looks like, well, she just cares about you, or he just really loves you, it can make you feel a little crazy to try to get other people to get it. And the last thing is what layers all of this engulfment is you just feel so much guilt. Guilt determines a lot of the things you do and say with these parents. My Shih Tzu's having nightmares. Okay, so that's what it feels like. So when we're talking about these kind of parents, what is really happening is that at the core, when they are engulfing you, they are really unaware of your unique needs and who you are. And they're not really interested in cultivating that separateness. It is never about you and always about helping them get their needs met. And a lot of what happens is dominated by their attempts to control and influence you, right? So that's that over-involvement. It's not about you. It is about you doing what they want you to do, what they think is important or successful or meaningful. And you often live in this illusion of who they really are. And it can be difficult. Many of these parents, if they're especially covert and not super rageful or whatever, it's like people will say that they went, until they were adults, they had no idea their parent was a narcissist. Especially if, like I'm saying, they're the less obvious kind. Now we have so much conversation and social media, I feel like it's changing. But the bottom line is, like, you felt like it was always for your own good. And you start to realize, actually, it was not really about me. So what can you do if this is happening for you? This conversation around separating, which is the core from these kind of parents and dynamics and wounds, is much bigger than this video. But we're just going to focus on the trapped parts, how to access and recognize them. The first one is to begin to understand that the core feelings are really two things, maybe three. Number one, it is fear. That you have a fear of hurting them, of really being on your own, of identifying your own needs, of displeasing them. That fear drives a lot of why you stay trapped. For me, my mom, it was a sort of a cycle of abuse. It would be good. We'd have a good time. She'd be great. I would feel the tension building. I would know, oh my God, like I could feel it. But back then I wasn't really aware of this cycle. I just could feel myself eggshelling more and more, walking on eggshells. Then there would be a massive blow, and it would either culminate in her, moving out, stomping away, leaving. Sometimes there'd be periods of time where we didn't speak for a little while. Or we would really I would quickly try to reduce it, apologize, make everything okay, repress my own needs. But it really is about that fear. And then at the core, you often feel a lack of worthiness. That's like a big piece of who you are because you never got to get that separate sense of self cultivated, and a lot of deep distrust in relationships. So we're really trying to address these dynamics. Okay. The first thing is you have to start to understand that separation is the dynamic we're focusing on, like I said, and that acceptance is the key. Now, what's really hard is even accepting it can feel like a betrayal to you, like you are doing something wrong. People like this will come to therapy and will start talking about their parents, and either it takes us a long time to get there, Or even when they do, they're like, oh, I just feel bad saying these things. So it's like giving yourself permission to just accept it. Even at that point, you don't have to necessarily do anything, but to just say, yeah, I do feel like there's a trapped situation for me. I do feel that guilt drives a lot of why I engage with her. I'm also terrified to lose her or him, but I also resent them. Like, you just start to accept the dynamics of what's happening. Number 2 is to work on setting boundaries. So with many of these parents, there's a process you can go through while you start to set little boundaries. We're going to do this thing on the holiday this year, and we're going to come over at this time. And you sort of little by little, or, bigger if that's what works for you. But if you're trying to manage big blows, and many parents will be motivated to not lose you, so they'll begrudgingly or blow and then adjust. Some parents just won't. I've seen some people do this actually where it kind of blows up. They don't speak for a while, but when the parent returns, it's like they got the memo and they start to shift a bit. Some parents just repeatedly push back and will not take it. And then, of course, that can lead to roads of low contact, no contact, things like that. And by the way, I have never met anyone who hasn't tried a million different ways before they start to implement like no contact as a result, because they feel like they could not do anything else. The next thing is to work on your own identity and authenticity. A big piece of this is that you have learned to sacrifice who you are, and you don't really know who you are, right? And so doing identity work on, what do I love? What do I care about? What do I value? Things like that. And then to begin to implement those things in your life. So if you always, were an artist, but you're not painting, why aren't you painting, for example? Like, what is getting in your way? Or if you've always wanted to pursue something, but it wasn't acceptable to that parent, maybe your first little, job is to just research it and to start to say, I wonder what this might be like, something like that. So it's cultivating identity work. The next thing is to work on the core wounds for you, which is guilt and betrayal. And what often overlies that is this parent sacrificed so much for me. But basically they were just being parents. They were supposed to provide food and shelter and nurture and support or whatever, but it's been given to you verbally or unconsciously or all of the above as, I sacrificed everything for you, right? I could have had a career. I didn't. I went to all your games, whatever it is. If it's the over-involving kind. If it's the not so much over-involving, let's say in a more parent who might have a more borderline profile, it's more about the emotions of like, I did everything for you. Because oftentimes you're in a best friend role with these kind of parents. You're their therapist, and that's true for really any of these kind of parents. But you just get this message that it's a betrayal for you to even have a separate sense of self and not be in that trap dynamic. The next thing is there's a risk of you also being an engulfing parent if you had an ignoring parent, right? And your parent was never there. So now you're like doing too much. And or if that's just all you know and you haven't yet figured out and honored that, even though, that's how you felt, you didn't really understand that. And so you're parenting the same way. So to be aware of that. And then the last few things are to focus on your internal negative beliefs about your allowance to even be a separate self, to look at distortions of thoughts, to look at the ways you might unconsciously sabotage separation. Like I'm saying, for example, if this parent is a narcissistic parent who doesn't respect you or listen to your childcare requests, and you feel like, yeah, but no one else is safe, but you continually don't get anyone else to help with childcare, you may feel like there's no other option or you feel like it's going to hurt their feelings if you get a different babysitter. But if you don't do anything, you are staying in that dynamic. And so you have to look at your behaviors and beliefs that might be sabotaging your ability to separate and not live in that trap. And then, of course, things like remothering and reparenting yourself, all of those where I talk about you're not just reparenting the inner child, you're reparenting, for many of us, we're into adulthood now when we realize these things. And so our adult self has some beliefs too about what things look like. So it's about learning with, self-compassion and how to reorganize how you see your entitlement to be a separate self and to separate from these kinds of parents. I thought I'd give you just a few journal questions if you just want to think about these things. The first one is to understand that engulfment plays out often in a mix of anxious and avoidant patterns in your own adult relationships. So what does that mean? What I mean is that you, as a result of these parents, because the core is about a lack of consistent safety and validation, is that you might find yourself on the one hand really anxious and overanalyzing and worried about relationships, but at times also because of that engulfment that you had in this caregiver, when your partner wants too much from you, or they're demanding more vulnerability, or you feel at risk, you pull back and you shut down emotions. You don't engage as much as you could. You minimize their thoughts and feelings. You really stuff your own belief systems around the safety of relationships. So you might swing, right? It's like you're so worried they're going to abandon you and leave you like this parent, but also when it feels like they're trying to consume you, but maybe all they're really doing is asking like, well, what's your schedule at the mall today? Right? And so it feels like a demand for your time. And you're like, what do you mean? Right? So you push back, things like that. It can be very unconscious. And maybe they are a controlling partner, but it may just be that you're getting demands that feel like those same feelings, but they're actually different. So you want to look at those behaviors and kind of break down, where do I do these things and what triggers them? What makes me worry and overthink and analyze? And what makes me want to remove myself, shut them down, not text them back, play games, look for a different partner, things like that. Number one, where do I worry in this relationship, for example? So what makes me afraid of losing this partner or their love? Number two, when I feel like this partner is asking too much or wanting too much or trying to control me, my tendency is to what? And oftentimes this will align with a trauma response, right? The fight, flight, fawn, freeze, collapse, submit, those type of things. Attach, cry out for help. And you can check out a video I think I have here on this topic, and I'll make some more. But the way you act it out is often in your trauma responses. And most of us have a couple ways we tend to lean: fight, flight, things like that, freeze, whatever. So what do I do? And how can I work on that? Do I over apologize? Do I shut down? Do I tend to go out of town and take a girls trip and then, sabotage the trust dynamic, things like that, or guys trip or humans trip? Number three is if I let myself accept that my partner is not trying to consume me. So these are really focused on how this plays out with our partners. How would I respond differently, right? So if I separated and realize this is not actually about the engulfment, I actually have a pretty good partner here, but I'm putting a lot of feelings on them, projecting things that don't belong to them. If I could recognize that, what would I do differently? Alongside that is if I am repeating these exact same patterns and my partner is the same, I would say get a therapist, right? Because the chances are it's much bigger than that. And that's often, if you can't get a therapist, get some books on attachment, on trauma responses, on eggshell parents, on narcissistic parents, things like that. And I have a list on my drkimsage.com website of just all the books that I love that I think are really helpful, especially around narcissistic, eggshell, borderline, traumatized parents, immature parents. And lastly, just really focusing on what do I really want to work on as it involves feeling trapped in my life, in my parent relationship, in my partner relationship, just identifying the feelings around what it might feel like and beginning to think about what might help. I say this because as I was watching really quickly, going back to the beginning of this video, that news story, even though it's been many, many years, I felt that squeezing on my heart. Like when I was in it, I, as I've talked about, loved her and hated her so much and felt so dependent. Like, how will I ever survive without her? And yet, as I've shared in so many videos, being in situations in my mid to late 40s, crying my eyes out after she name called me, gone after my kids, really done and said very harmful things. But it was all I ever knew was this swinging, toxic back and forth. And it was a very toxic relationship. But that doesn't mean that there were times when we didn't have a good time and have a similar sense of humor or laugh together. Of course, the best years we ever had were the very few handful of years in between college and me finding a partner after I had lost both of my stepdad and dad, and I hadn't really no one else. And in retrospect, that makes sense. That was the most bonded because I didn't really have anybody else but her, and she had me, and that felt really safe to her. And the threats really began because the engulfment could not continue in the same degree once I chose a partner. And with every child I had, and there are 4, it would always there would always be a blow up during my pregnancy, when they were first born, when I needed her the most. It was like a threat. Every person took me further away from her. And so I was trying to balance all of that and keeping her happy. And that went on for another, 15, 16, 17 years. So my point is that if you are in these relationships with these parents, you get what I mean when I say you feel engulfed and trapped and suffocated. And I wish I had understood that then. I just kept feeling like if I could just make her happy, take better care of her, balance things more, forgive her, whatever it was. But it really did significant damage to my sense of self and relationships. And every part of my life, right? Mental, physical, and emotional. So that's why I wanted to share. All right, that's it for today's video. I hope it was helpful. I'm going to really focus right now. I keep circling back to how do we build more emotional resilience? How do we try to change our lives more? And I've made so many videos on topics around these parents, as well as courses, as I sat back and took a break from social media, mostly from, TikTok and Instagram the last few weeks. I think I posted one video on YouTube about a week and a half ago. I just circle back to where is my heart the most passionate? What topics do I really just don't ever get tired of talking about? And they really are about helping people understand and heal from these patterns that are often found with parents who truly do, for whatever reasons, genetics, trauma, struggle with things like narcissism, immaturity, borderline, obviously trauma, like I keep saying. But it's just that I just feel so connected to that. And so that's why I'm here, and that's going to be our focus for now. So thanks again for being here. Please take care of yourself and know that you are worthy of living a life that doesn't feel so, heavy and weighted down by the need to stay in the same childhood roles, except now you're living your adult life and you just want to live a freer, more loving, more peaceful life. You are deserving and worthy of that. Okay, take care. See you soon.